Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Nun Beis begins with a brief discussion as to whether you get 4 amos when you set up a bread Erev Tchumen or not. Then we have 3 Mishnayos. The first Mishnah is the one we see quoted on Daf Nun Aleph, discussing what happens when somebody is traveling on the road, but he has to come home briefly. Is he still considered on the road as far as being able to use speech just to create an Erev, not bread? We'll have a machlokas about that, and then a machlokas Amoraim explaining the machlokas Tanoim. Anywhere we'll bring another Mishnah. This Mishnah teaches us the halach of somebody who finds himself outside the Tchum, when he's allowed to come back in, if there is an overlap between his 4 amos and the Tchum. And the last Mishnah, somebody who's coming from outside the city, and his Tchum ends just shy of the city, can he continue into the city or not? First, the Gemara presents a question asked by Rami Bar Chama. We know the halach is that if somebody creates his makom shvisa in a certain place by going there, and he's standing there, and this becomes his permanent residence, then his residence gets a defined area of 4 amos, if he's outside a city, 4 square amos, and his 2,000 amos tchum starts outside those 4 amos. Question is, what happens if he creates his permanent residence by having bread be placed somewhere, by having a meal, or having food placed somewhere? Does he get 4 amos for that or not? So Gemara says, well, based on our last Mishnah, we can prove the answer to this. Rava says, we saw that the final statement in the Mishnah was that the rule of creating an Erev, that you can create an Erev by placing a meal there in a certain spot, that's meant to be making things easier for you. It's meant to be a leniency. So obviously then you wouldn't lose your 4 amma area. If you lost your 4 amma area, it wouldn't be making things easier for you, it would be making things harder for you. Of course, that's not necessarily a proof. It just, the Mishnah meant to say that it's making things easier for you in the sense that you don't have to go schlep over there. You could send somebody to take the food for you instead of having to go stand there and wait there Erev Shabbos. In that sense, it's easier for you. It could be that it's harder for you in a different sense, that you do lose those 4 amos is not necessarily a proof. Okay, now we start our first Mishnah. For the Daf, this Mishnah was quoted on Daf Nun Aleph. The Mishnah relates to the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir that we had seen earlier. Again, we saw that according to Rabbi Meir, you're only supposed to be using some other Erev other than placing food if you don't have food, if you don't have bread. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the bread is meant to make things easier for you, and therefore you could do whatever you want. However, both opinions agree that if you do have bread, you shouldn't be making an Erev by saying, just verbally saying, my Malcolm Shvisa, my permanent residence should be in X spot. That you can't do if you have bread. Now, what do we mean by having bread and not having bread? So the Gemara had defined that as an ani and an ashir, a rich man and a poor man. It means somebody who is in a situation where he readily has bread available, meaning he's home. We assume that everybody has a meal in their house, no matter how poor they are. Somebody, however, who's on the road, who's traveling, doesn't necessarily have food with him, and therefore that would be a person who doesn't have bread. So the Gemara, the Mishnah now wants to define how do we define somebody who's on the road, and how do we define somebody who's at home? What is the definition of those things? And that is going to be the contrast between the 2 different psakim for different individuals in the Mishnah. There's also going to be a machlokas in the Mishnah between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. So let's get the case straight. The Mishnah says somebody left his house to travel to a different city, and then he was called back. A friend of his stopped him. He said, come home, it's too hot, it's too cold, whatever it is. So he briefly went home again, and then he intends to set out again to go back to the city that he was planning on traveling to in the first place. So again, he set out on the road, he was called back, but he really does plan to continue traveling. Question, is that called somebody who's on the road, or is that called somebody who's home? He's home for the minute right now, but he's still traveling. He still plans to go. How do you view this guy? If you view him as somebody who's at home, so then he would not be able to make an Erev by saying, my Makom Shvisa should be in X spot, right? Both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda agree that you can't make an Erev by saying something if you're a person who has bread, meaning you're based at home. If, however, we define him as being on the road, so then he would be allowed to make an Erev by saying, my Makom Shvisa should be in such and such spot. So the Mishnah says the cases where this guy came home, our questions are going to be, is he defined as being at home or on the road? And it plays out because what ended up happening was that he said, I'm making my Erev midway between the city that I live in and the city that I'm traveling to, and he needed to have an Erev there. It's 4,000 amos between the cities. He needs to have an Erev halfway, an Erev Tchumen, and he needs to have his Malcham Shvisa halfway, and he did it by speaking. So is it valid or not? Depends if you view him as being a traveler or you view him as being somebody at home. So the Mishnah's psak is as follows. According to Rabbi Yehuda, we say that he is a traveler and everybody else in the city is at home. So for him, making an Erev by saying my Malcham Shvis is over there works. For everybody else, it doesn't work. The Gemara is going to have to explain what the difference is. According to Rabbi Meir, we're kind of stuck, and therefore he's limited to both his Erev and his house. It's like we don't know which one it is, or we are machmir for both of them, and the only place he's allowed to walk is the overlap of the two tchumen, one 2,000 amos surrounding his house, and one 2,000 amos surrounding where he said his Erev should be. That's the two psakim of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. The Gemara now explains it, what's going on over here. The Gemara says as follows. In Rabbi Yehuda, the situation is that the guy had a house in the other city, so he left his house and is going to his other house. Therefore, he's considered to be a traveler. Because he has a house there, he's not going to come back. He set out to go. He's going to go. He came back briefly because they called him back, but he's really considered to be somebody who's a traveler. He's on the road. Therefore, he's allowed to make an Erev by saying, my Erev should be there. And the Erev hits, and it counts, and he's allowed to go. Everybody else in the city that he's leaving from doesn't have a house there. So when they say, I'm having my Erev in that spot, it doesn't work. Because he's not considered to be on the road. They're considered to be at home. Somebody who's at home has bread. He should have made an Erev with bread, and it's not good enough that he said, I'm making my Erev in X and X spot. Now, that's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. According to Rabbi Meir, you don't become a traveler just because you have a house over there. You're still considered not to be a traveler, and therefore, the fact that you made an Erev by saying my Erev should be in that spot doesn't count. There's two versions in Rashi are exactly what his psak is. Is it a suffix or is it that he loses both places? The more widely accepted psak seems to be that he loses both of his Eruvin. Therefore he's limited to the other Eruv in each one, and he's only allowed to go to the place that's overlapped by both Eruvin. But he's not considered a traveler just because he has a house in that spot. Now the Gemara brings a brisa which supports this explanation of the Mishnah. This brisa only quotes Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, and it clearly says that if somebody's traveling from one city to another because he has a house there, and somebody stopped him and said it's too hot or it's too cold, so the halacha is he's allowed to continue traveling because the Erev that he said, that he set up by speaking, is good enough since he has a house that he's going to over there. Now, that brisa doesn't end there. The brisa does quote another opinion, not Rabbi Meir, but it quotes Rabbi Yosi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yosi seems to say that he wants to argue on his father, and he says, not only is it true that he's allowed to continue, but, and this is what he says, even his friend stops him and says, come here, stop and rest, and then later he continues, that's enough. So the Gemara says he says he's arguing, but it sounds the same. What's the difference? So the Gemara has a machlokes amar on what the difference is. Rabbah says the difference that is whether or not you have to actually be traveling on the road. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you have to actually be out traveling on the road in order to say my Erev is there. According to Rabbi Yosi, it's enough if you just planned on traveling. You didn't actually set out yet. But both agree that you do have to say my Erev is over there. That's Rabba's pshat. According to Rabbi Yosi, if the machlokes is, do you have to actually say it? You definitely have to be on the road. You have to actually set out on the road in order to be considered a traveler. The question is, do you have to say my Erev is there, or could you just have in mind that your Erev is over there? According to Rabbi Yehuda, you have to say it. According to Rabbi Yosi, his son, you just have to have it in mind. You don't have to actually spell it out. Gemara now brings the statement of Ula, which seems to fit in with this halacha. It's of Rabbi Yosef's explanation of Rabbi Yosi by Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Ula said the following thing. Ula said somebody that is assumed to be on the road, he's considered a traveler, and then he gets called home. So even though he's returned home, he is a traveler. So the Gemara says, well, which is he, a returned home or a traveler? So the Gemara explains, he's physically returned home. Halachically, he's a traveler, even though he is physically spending time at home. Right now, his status of traveler doesn't fall off, and therefore he's allowed to make an Erev just with the Erev being in a certain spot. He doesn't have to go travel there, and he doesn't have to place food there. So Gemara says, who is this opinion here? So the Gemara says this must be Rabbi Yosef's Prat Rabbi Yosi or Rabbi Yehuda, because we don't say here that he has to say my Erev is in X spot. It seems to be that just the fact that he intends for it to be there is enough. And it seems like he's actually gone home. He's all the way home. He's not on the road anymore. He does have the halachic status of being on the road, meaning he had to set out to travel and then return home. So because he has the halachic status of being on the road, it's enough and he doesn't have to spell it out. That seems to fit with that opinion. So Gemara now brings the story. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda bar Ishsasa brought a basket of fruit to Rav Nosson bar Roishia on Friday, and then he was about to leave to go home. So Rav Nosson waited until he went one step along the staircase, leaving his house, and then he called him back and said, spend the night. And then he was able to leave the next morning and travel, and he had, even though he had to go 4,000 amas, it was enough because he had an Erev Chatzeres. He had an Erev Tchumen. So Gemara's assumption here is that he didn't say anything. He didn't have to say, I'm setting up my Erev. Just the fact that he set out, he traveled one step, is enough for him to be considered on the road. And then he was called back, but he's still considered to be a traveler. Once he's a traveler, his Erev is enough. That sounds again like Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yosef's understanding. He doesn't have to say anything, it's assumed. And all he has to do is actually be considered to be on the road. And by setting out, he's considered on the road. Which is not necessarily. The Gemara says it could be as far from that as this could even be Rabbi Yehuda himself, his opinion. And how Rabbah explained it, that he actually did say something, that even though it's not recorded in the story, but he said, my Erev should be set up halfway between here and my house. And therefore, that the Erev is made by him saying that, and by the fact that he was considered to be a traveler on the road. Gemara now turns its attention to Rabbi Meir, and Gemara asks, why does he have to say that he's stuck between his two tchumen and he can only use the place that they overlap? We already saw one time that Rabbi Meir said halacha that somebody who has a suffix whether his Erev exists or not is stuck between the two tchumen, one of his original house and one of his potential Erev, because he doesn't know if the Erev is there or not. So he has to assume both of them l'chumra, and he can only travel within the place that they overlap. So we already saw that halacha. Why is he have to repeat it here? Gemara says this is different. This is not a suffix. Over there, we don't know whether it exists or not. Here, we know he certainly did not make an Erev. Meir is holding that the Erev that he made is no good. He's just saying a chiddush that you lose the part of your original tchum that's not included in the second tchum. Since you tried to make an Erev tchumen, you uprooted yourself from your original tchum, and you cut off the part of your original tchum that doesn't overlap with your second tchum. That's why he stuck to the overlap here. Not because it's a suffix, and we don't know which one's his correct tchum, but because you lost both of them. You lost the first one by trying to make a second one, and you didn't get the second one because you never made it. Therefore, the only thing you have is the place where you would have had, even if you had both of them, which is where they overlap. Now begin the next Mishnah, which discusses what happens when somebody finds himself outside of his tchum. He left his tchum on purpose, willingly violating Hilchos Tchumen, and now he's outside the tchum. So the halacha is that he has 4 amas in every direction. Question is, what happens if those 4 amas still overlap with the tchum that he left? Can he go back in? Since he's allowed to move 4 amas, he's allowed to move back within his tchum. So the Mishnah brings a machlekes. Rav Elazar says as long as he's within 2 amas, he's allowed to go back in, but if it's 3 amas, he's not allowed to go back in. Now Rav Elazar was of the opinion that the 4 amas that you have means you're in the center of a 4 amas square or circle. So you have 2 amas in each direction. So as long as you're within 2 amas of the tchum edge, you have an overlap and you can go back in. If you're 3 amas, then there's no overlap between your 4 amma area and the tchum, therefore you cannot go back in. So the Gemara first of all asks, what is the halacha of somebody standing 1 foot in the tchum and 1 foot out of the tchum? Is he allowed to go back in? Is he allowed to withdraw the foot that's out back into the tchum? So 2 versions of this. First version is that Rabbi Chanina says we learn out of the pasuk Im Toshiv Mishabas Raglecha. Raglecha is spelled, the ksiv is lashon yachid without a yud, which would be pronounced raglecha, but the kri is raglecha, which is with a yud, which is plural. So the first version is that Rabbi Chanina says, well, because of the ksiv, which is yachid, we say that the laws of tchumen apply even to just one leg, and you cannot bring that leg even inside the tchum. According to the second version, Rabbi Chanina said, well, the kri is raglecha, which is plural, and therefore you're allowed to bring the leg in. It's only a problem if you go two legs out of the tchum, but you're allowed to bring the leg in as long as it's still a majority. So the Gemara has a brisa on the subject. The Gemara has a brisa that says you are allowed to bring one leg in. So according to one version that fits with Rabbi Chanina, and according to one version that is against Rabbi Chanina, the Gemara says that is the opinion of Acherim. Again, according to one version, Rabbi Chanina is saying like him, and according to one version, Rabbi Chanina is saying against him. But there's another machlokas that argues, there's another shita that argues on Acherim, and that supports the other position. Okay, now the Gemara asks on Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah who had said that if you're 2 amas out, you can come in, 3 amas you can't. The Gemara says there's a different brisa where he says that if you're 1 amma out, you couldn't come in, and 2 amas you can't. How do you explain the discrepancy? So the Gemara says in our Mishnah, he's talking about the space that you are within. If you're within 2 amas, is okay. In the other Mishnah, he's talking about the space between you and the tchum. There's 2 amas between you and the tchum, so then you're more than 2 amas from the tchum. That's a problem. It has to be only 1 amma between you and the tchum. You're occupying the second amma. And that's how it fits. And where it says 1 second, there's the third version here of Rabbi Eliezer where he says that even if you're only 1 amma, you can't come in. That doesn't fit in any way. How do you explain that? Where it says that's not talking about somebody who stepped outside the tchum on Shabbos. That's talking about somebody who's coming on the road and Shabbos begins. So we said that the halacha was that he's allowed to estimate 2,000 amas from where he was when Shabbos starts, and if he gets to within the tchum, then he can continue to the rest of the city. That, Rabbi Eliezer said, is if he's even 1 amma from the tchum, he cannot go into the rest of the city. He didn't come out of the tchum. He doesn't have 4 amas from where his 2,000 amas end. His 4 amas are where he started. So therefore he can't go even 1 inch further. Okay, this ends this Gemara. Now we have the next brief Mishnah, which discusses this exact case. Somebody who's coming from outside the city, Shabbos falls on him as he's traveling. He can estimate 2,000 amas. He takes 2,000 average size steps. Each one is an average of an amma. And if he gets within the tchum, he's good. Otherwise, he's stuck outside the city for the entire Shabbos. Now, Rabbi Shimon says as long as he's within 15 amas of the tchum, he can continue into the tchum even though it's Shabbos. Why? So Rabbi Shimon says because the people who mark off the tchumen, when they make a siman to show where the tchum starts, they are machmir 15 amas. They make the siman 15 amas closer to the city than it actually is. And the reason they do that is because people make mistakes. The Gemara explains just 3 words. The Gemara explains what mistakes, and that's referring to those in the city who are traveling. They are walking out from the city. They sometimes travel up to 15 amas past the sign. That's why they put the sign 15 amas closer, so that those people will still be inside the tchum and can still come back. That is the end of Parak Misha Hoitziyu, the 4th parak.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.